Okay, so perhaps first off, and as a way into the discussion, maybe I could invite some responses specifically to David's paper that might open out to other things. One aspect if I may, open on to issues that were discussed by all of our 5 speakers was perhaps a place that was earlier on in your paper, again regarding the question of neuroscience and perhaps a resistance to Euphrasia in terms of hermeneutics and explanation, but it's something that's persisted, I think, throughout all 5 papers, a kind of art practice that seeks a space or seeks a kind of process that's inassimilable to certain kinds of explanation or ordering. And Maggie, I think you talked about the intimacy of the index in your paper. Briony spoke about the poignancy within a very strict and systematic practice. Michael talked about the states of both enjoyment and disruption within this blank, and David's also talking about a kind of a tangle which can accommodate all kinds of other maybe affective dimensions, and I wondered if you could perhaps speak again to the relationship between affective life and attempts to systematise of various sorts.
Yes, I think that what you're describing there sort of comes out clearly in definitions of entanglement, rather than tangle as such, and these terms, entanglement has mostly, sort of negative or pejorative connotations. If you look, sort of simply at the dictionary definition of it as a kind of unsuitable or sort of unsavoury involvement, typically with another person, a kind of liaison. But I think the idea of entanglement does represent a threat to the sort of autonomous, separate subject. But of course, there's a important philosophical discourse about autonomy that sort of subtends modernism and is, I think Rosalind Krauss expresses this very well, that it's represented there sort of bodied forth in the form of the grid, and hence, sort of in the sort of little historical, sort of excursus about surrealist automatism, I think one could see the automatist line as a kind of tangle or a sort of form of entanglement, even of consciousness with something, of the subject with something else, and in opposition, or at least in counterpoint to the sort of, the classic sort of modernist grid that emerges in the 1920s.
And Susan, maybe are those things, the connections that David's drawing in that regard, are they things that you would respond to yourself?
Yeah, when we were discussing the sort of theme that you might explore, I was very interested in, because you said you were also painting, in just the idea of things running and pooling, and sort of paint itself kind of knotting, and so there's a sense of something kind of a liquidity that produces these clumps of something that might kind of be impenetrable or disturbing. So
I think in the sort of discourse around, sort of that I was looking at around the structure of the brain, the tangle seems to be, sort of understood. Well, it's it has in common with weaving threads. The thread that it, sort of the weave, the woven line seems to be more, sort of identified with something that's regular, with more, that's more like a grid, whereas the tangle is something that is something other to that. So, as I say, I think I'm perhaps on more slippery ground in terms of trying to suggest a, convergence with the tapestries around this point.
But that quote, that Sebald quote of the weavers trapped in, put into this, harnessed into the machines, he does make comparisons with the melancholic weavers kind of haunted through the night, and the comparison is made with them, the weavers and writers, who also have the same kind of disturbances of sleep because they think they've gotten hold of the wrong thread. And that's such a nightmarish idea that you've somehow lost, your train of thought has somehow got lost or tangled up into something else. So that in that sense, a tangle is very disturbing. But I felt there was something you were offering in terms of, there was more the things that I'm interested in, this kind of resistance or kind of rebellious kind of knotting that stays outside of the kind of orderly constraints.
There is a sort of conflict in my mind going on here, because I took a really lovely photograph just with my phone of a close-up of Jackson Pollock's, is it 10 fathoms? Anyway, deep, it's a one. 5 fathoms, sorry. It's a wonderful tangle,
yes.
Especially this close-up that I took. I would want to suggest that we're living in, a sort of post-abstract expressionist era still, and under the dominance of a reaction to that direct and effusive and wonderful kind of expressive gesture. And that's why I suppose, you get these, like the Oulipo, sort of restrictions and so on that are taken into visual art of kind of confining one's response to affect to very minimal, marginal area, not making it any the less intense, but just maybe compressed is the right word, I'm not quite sure. And it's one thing that I like about Susan's work, I think, is that, it sort of combines those two things of being about affect and movement and so on, but having the systematicity and rigor, and even scientific kind of basis, along with the affect. Yeah.
I was thinking about contingency in a way that people have spoken about, because in one sense, the work of entanglement or the work of fading that Michael was talking about, or these things in some ways they can but they cannot equate with the shape of things that we might associate with either a fade or a knot. And it's interesting in Susan's tapestries, the way perhaps the most disruptive work of all, which might contradict me, is when there are those gaps that are the strips where actually you see the reverse, which is in a way just a kind of interruption, but that could be the kind of disordering work, even though in a way it looks the very simplest possible strip. So I was just kind of interested in, when we talk about systems and perhaps what escapes the system or what in some way could, it could be a knot, but it could be something quite different, and that sense of the random or chance that's always been going through the discussions from the beginning seems important in what that work might be, because it's kind of going to be unexpected.
I like what Briony was just saying about the tangle in relation to what I was saying, because it sort of comes in between distance and the collapse of distance. It's neither something one can take a distance from, nor is it completely the collapse of distance into, say, some kind of blank. So tangle is a sort of in between. I wonder about the putting it within a sort of order-disorder polarity. I remember hearing that mathematicians are really interested in why things get tangled. And there are ways of providing a mathematical explanation of the tangle, or equations of the tangle, or something like that. So, it might not be such a simple duality. And in terms of dualities, the gender implications interest me, because the tangle can't help reminding me of pubic hair. And I wonder where, in terms of the sexual polarity, pubic hair would stand, or what it would do to any kind of binary. I note that pubic hair in pornography is usually shaved off. So, what is the threat of pubic hair to the sort of pornographic scenario? Why is the tangle kind of avoided? Maybe something disappears into it, or there's it suggests some other kind of relationship not assimilable to those sorts of structures.
We'll go there.
Weaving pubic hair might be interesting. Are you planning?
Just a question.
It's on your boys.
I was thinking about the work specifically in relation to the idea of systems of control, as much as anything, systems of surveillance, and the sort of the threat to, I suppose, a kind of everyday freedom or autonomy. And I was coming back to this question I think I tried to raise earlier. I was reminded of the essay Derrida wrote on Bataille, and he said, I can't remember exactly, but he said effectively Bataille's reading of Hegel was to attempt to try and say in the language of servility that which was free. So it was actually by a kind of reappropriation or a kind of affirmation of those structures, a following closely of those structures, that a kind of a freedom arises through servility itself. And I wondered if that had any kind of resonance with what the process by which you make your work.
It may not be a direct response to what you to your question, but I've been reflecting today that for us it's hard to think about sort of big data without having it the kind of information that's being sort of collected and stored about all of this without a certain sort of wariness in the light of revelations of what's done with that data, and the fact that it's sort of it's just sort of collected without us even knowing about it. But I wonder, and perhaps Briony would be able to comment on this, whether conceptual artists in the 1960s and 70s had that sort of degree of skepticism about data and systems, or whether it's whether they look to it as a sort of refreshing alternative to painting and its protocols.
Well, I'm sure everybody has interesting things to say about that, but I think in some ways there is something quite ambivalent, isn't there, about data, because the way in which we see the work of those conceptual artists now, in some ways, the pleasure of indexing, the pleasure of filing cabinets, and in some ways I think that ambivalence was always there, that kind of fascination with systems, which, in a way, you had those, the super enthusiasts like, Buckminster Fuller, not a conceptual artist, but you had, I think even then that kind of big data could become a kind of fetish object, and there is something hugely, freighted also with anxiety about it. So I think that was there from the outset, but I think also with hindsight, conceptual art has come to obviously look less like a dematerialization, because as those things have aged, the kind of pleasurable aspects of the bits and pieces that they used, I think we kind of have come to see, because it's no longer just what painting isn't, that kind of, the work of negation was always important, but, now it doesn't feel only like that. So I think, just as minimalism seemed at the time to be a sabotage of the art object, now looks much more like how to make a sculpture. I think there was always that, and in a way Onkawara showed very dramatically that he always had a relationship to painting, and whilst that was not the only thing he had, that was a very significant part of what his work was. So I really think yes, in some ways I think what you're getting at is really right, that there was, it's all relative, isn't it? And big data seems to us the biggest that it's ever been. It seems kind of inconceivable, but, look at Hannah Darboven, look at the way in which artists like she or Dieter Roth or any of those other artists that, were actually dramatising that, I guess. Not picturing it, but dramatising it.
Well, information theory was very much in the air in the 1960s. I mean, Pamela Lee has done a lot of work around this. So artists were relating what they did to information theory, which was in fact also linked with military at that time, just as things of the data is linked with surveillance now. And art was tending to be thought in terms of information as a way of perhaps getting out of, sort of ideas of matter and form and so on. But information in relation to things like its dependence on noise or entropy in Smithson. Smithson was very interested in information theory, but in how systems run down, how systems depend on disorder for their order, things like that. I think that was, and in questions of repetition, to those aspects.
Would that be a place to bring you back in, Susan, in terms of a few points in terms of a relationship with big data and query, and also maybe with painting that's been brought up?
I've just thought of an answer to the index shadow thing in relation to, say, data. Sort of big data isn't so interesting to me, except that I think the idea of accumulating stuff, and so that's the opposite of a kind of interest in entropy, where something just accumulates and accumulates and accumulates. But I think that the data thing, that if we think about like when we're using data, I think it's the weirdness of digital technology that doesn't have a kind of material thing at all. And yet has this relation to the index is...
Well, one of the things about the difference between the 60s and ours, it was pre-digital, the 60s. So when we think about these things, we think about them in relation to the digital. So including thinking about contingency and the indexical. In a way, they're now unthinkable outside that kind of context. And I think one of the interesting things about Susan's work is that it cuts across any possible opposition, in the sense that the tapestries are, if you like, the digitalization of the analog, aren't they? I mean, it's taking a duration and turning it into sort of zeros and ones. So it's not, it's not one against the other. It's the problem of the relation that seems to emerge for me.
Yeah, I often wonder if one shouldn't sort of disentangle, if you like, the analog and the index, because the analog is the continuous signal, whereas with a lot of processes nowadays, they're sort of converted to zeros and ones and then turned into something else, so that it's very much a discontinuous signal.
But the point is the relationship between the two.
Yes.
Which goes right back, into classical, Greek geometry and the idea of dividing a continuum. What is the relationship between the discontinuous and the continuous? You can divide a continuum infinitely and never get anywhere.
We have one question from the floor. If that's okay.
That is good.
Thanks for this interesting discussion. I wanted to ask about, alarm bells kind of ring for me a little bit when we're having a conversation about the relationship between systematicity and contingency, in abstraction from what that might mean in context, right? So, for example, what I mean is in Susan's work, we get a kind of interruption, which might be an interruption of sleep. That's a very specific kind of concrete interruption that can happen. And I think there is a kind of tendency sometimes to talk about contingency and interruption as a kind of inherently liberating or ungovernable thing, right? And that's sort of a concern, I think, because again in Susan's work we can see things like the sort of production of subjectivity, which is kind of in the background of this, biopolitics and the production of a kind of individualized contingent subjectivity as something that isn't necessarily liberating, isn't necessarily freeing. I wonder if anybody would have anything to respond to that. But I'm interested in thinking about how we might historicise these issues. It seems to be quite important to me.
Interesting relation to the weaving as a sort of industrial era of industrial capitalism, and that in relation to a very different situation now as well, perhaps.
But the beginning of all that kind of measurement as well happened with the invention of the loom. Actually, I was just thinking of what you were saying in relation to the question that preceded yours about civility, right? And I was just wondering about the relation between civility and something that's between being, not being or not non-being, but something that's this sleep that you talk about, this kind of suspension, I suppose, of something. So there's it's not an either or. It's some kind of strange place in between, and you can look at some of those kind of uses of hypnosis, and that when you give over control to something, you sort of get into the half state as a productive place.
Of course, there is no contingency in Freud, at least in his understanding of the mind. There's a strict psychic causality and determinism, even of sort of interrupted sleep. That would be have some cause that could be elicited as far as Freud was concerned.
Well, I think one of the things that interests me in relation to art is the way that standard relation between necessity and contingency is disrupted. Because, I mean, the counter term to contingency is necessary. You know, it's not necessary, it's contingent, which means they could be otherwise. And necessary means it can only be that way. But what happens when necessity becomes itself contingent? You know, that's something that Contaneas has discussed very interestingly in his book on contingency, but also his book on Malame. You know, what happens when the necessary rule for a work of art becomes utterly contingent, you know, a sort of totally arbitrary thing, you know, but it's at the same time absolutely necessary, because without it there wouldn't be a work of art. So, and if that applies to your work, Susan.
Well, I mean, it's talked about how every time you make a decision, you get shaped by another decision. And, yeah.
But you make a decision, you create a structure.
Or I deny that I make a
It's
decision.
the necessity of
Yeah.
the work, but the structure itself, you know, has a kind of contingency.
Yeah.
It could always be otherwise.
I think there's a parallel in some respects in the preoccupation with sort of discovering grounds or foundations, and certainly connects with this concept, notion of necessity that you just spoke about, Michael. And you know, it seems to have been a sort of recurrent preoccupation within modernism, or at least as I see it, the question that modernist artists had to ask themselves was that of the grounds for painting, you know, sort of, and you know, I think that is to some extent sort of reflected in that, you know, the grid is an expression of the ground in that sense. Whereas, you know, people like sort of, you know, for people like sort of Deleuze and so on, a kind of anti-foundationalism, a sort of critique of foundationalism is seen as inherently and politically, you know, sort of liberating. But it, you know, brings with it its own anxieties, of course, that, you know, sort of Heidegger, you know, kind of works through, or acts out, depending on your vocabulary.
Well, in one sense, isn't it the
the
artifice of the imagined fictional system that is absolutely not a single, or, you know, there are many, many different possible varieties of what this might be, that's temporarily held in place in the artwork, because in one sense the question is, you know, what does hold the work together in the light of that degree of disruption. And if you, I think I agree with you, you know, if you just go with the disruptiveness, it's a kind of romanticism about certain kinds of artistic freedom, and in a way these are, you know, those crazy Oulipo systems could become overly precious, there's no doubt, and now they manifest themselves differently in your work, very differently, but it's almost a kind of necessary holding place for art, and that can actually take so many different shapes. And that's the problem, even how we describe it, you know, because sometimes it's obviously not a thing, you know, not a something at all, but just something that happens. And so I think that's in a way our problem, you know, of how we describe it. But I really agree that, you know, the question of what holds it together, how you carry on making it, in a way, is the really difficult one, harder to talk about.
Might be easier to talk about over a drink.
You're here.
Unless there's anything burning that anyone wants to raise, should we thank our five speakers?